Hello. It's so wonderful to be in conversation with you. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you all for coming. So today's session is on pandemic, parables, and prophecies, and it centers around Amitav Ghosh's latest 3 books, Jungle Nama, The Living Mountain, and The Nutmeg's Curse. So your 3 latest books are aflame with historical insight and moral power. They seem to have been ignited through the spirits of the earth, the rivers, the mountains, the forests, various non-human flora and fauna. And these non-human voices become the argument for the necessity of the native point of view, in other words, the indigenous narrative, in a way what we've just seen through a short retelling of Jungle Nama. And these non-human voices become the necessity for the native point of view, the indigenous narrative. And this narrative presents itself as a parable for our times. So in a way, these 3 books read together blend the powers of history and of mythology. And you do this by contrasting 2 views of nature. You call them mechanistic and vitalism. And so basically, vitalism is the belief that humans are not really, humans are not the only ones that have souls, but non-humans too. And mechanistic is more what I would say Philippe Descola called naturalism. It's a very Western understanding of nature, where you basically think that nature is separate and different. And as humans, you are above nature, you are the ones in power, and therefore, previously you could shoot everything down. Today, you sort of want to protect some species, and you still exterminate others. So what I liked is that you highlight the difference between these 2 conceptions of nature through the beautiful quote of Oglala Lakota chief Standing Bear, who says, "We did not think of the great open plains, the beautiful rolling hills and winding streams with tangled growth as wild. Only to the white man was nature a wilderness, and only to him was the land infested with wild animals and savage people. To us it was tame, earth was bountiful, and we were surrounded with the blessings of the great mystery." Written against the background of the COVID pandemic and the Black Lives Matter protests, and interweaving discussions on colonialism, climate change, the migrant crisis, the animal spirituality of indigenous communities everywhere, The Nutmeg's Curse offers a sharp critique of Western society and reveals the profoundly remarkable ways in which human history is shaped by non-human forces. And I wondered if you could perhaps tell us a little more about the process that brought you to this realization.
Well, first of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here, especially with you, Annu, because I feel that you and I have been in a conversation for the last 23 years, ever since, almost to the day, 23 years ago, no, almost to the week, when we went to the Bon Bibi Pujo in the jungle, in the Sundarban, with the villagers of Rajat Jubilee. And that was a completely unforgettable experience and an unforgettable day. And fortunately, I had an old video camera with me to take footage of it, which I still have. And it's probably going to surface at some point. But, you know, that experience, being in the Sundarban, I think it played a completely, you know, pivotal part in my life. Because just seeing what was happening in the forest right then, already back then, even though I would not have called myself someone who accepted the realities of climate change, but already when we were there, we could see the effects of sea level rise, we could see the effects of saltwater intrusion. And actually, after I published The Hungry Tide, then we could see even more around about 2009 when Cyclone Aila hit, what a devastating impact it had. And I must say that, you know, what I've seen over the years in the Sundarban has made me really genuinely terrified of what the future holds. because I was there just as you were. Our paths very briefly crossed in the Sundarban exactly on Makar Sankranti, which is the day of the Bon Bibi Pujo. And over the years, one has seen the wildlife basically disappear from the Sundarban. And, I remember in the past, you would see so many flocks of birds, you would see so many kinds of raptors and so on. This time, birds were really few and far between. I mean, I'm just saying this anecdotally. It's not like I did a survey. But there were so few birds. Didn't see any raptors except one common Brahmini kite. I mean, you see more of those in Delhi than you do in the Sundarban. I mean, all that breeds, which has just been nominated for the Oscars, is about the Brahmini kites of Delhi. You see them there, but you don't see them in the Sundarban. And I must say, the biggest change that I saw in the Sundarban this time is that the unbelievable increase in tourism. I mean, back then in the past, you would hardly ever see a tourist boat. Now there were like hundreds, making an incredible noise, constantly, going up and down. And, so in effect, one of the most wonderful things about the Sundarban was its silence. Now there's never any silence. There are these loudspeakers constantly blasting. I mean, it's a story which is really, it's become a dystopia, is all I can say.
Totally. Thanks for bringing that. So perhaps, being in the Sundarban 23 years ago was the moment when it also was what brought me to work on the non-human. Remember, I had told you how I had told the islanders that I was working on their history, and they kept saying, if you don't go to the forest and you don't get to know about our tigers, what we have to say about our tigers, you won't be able to write about us. And I had been deeply unsettled by this kind of remark. And I think for an anthropologist who sort of wants to work on people, the fact that you are brought back to the forest, to the wild, to non-humans, I had to stop thinking of the wild. And I think this is also what you've been doing in your books, as a separate space, basically. And through the involvement of indigenous stories in our lives, basically start seeing nature and the environment as one, right? And this is what has been happening, I think, all over the world. People are increasingly organizing themselves into movements where nature, is increasingly part of their lives. But, you have that on the one hand, and you still have a lot of vested capitalist interests that are ultimately genocidal. So how do you reconcile the two? How do you think this will play out in the coming years?
I personally think this whole term nature is a part of the problem, So I never use it if I can help it, because just in using that term, you create a sort of distance between, let's say, culture and nature. So I think, one should try and avoid that term as far as possible. I mean, it's a term that should be, I think, banned.
Yes, like the term animal, right? Because it implies an inferior species.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely.
I think...
But your question about where do I think it's going? At this point, it's impossible to be Pollyanna-ish or excessively optimistic. I think it's going in a very, very bad direction, in every possible way. I mean, you look, I visited, let's say, Great Nicobar Island, in 2004, just after the terrible tsunami. And now they're going to make it into this kind of, they're going to shove off all the indigenous people, they're going to turn it into some kind of tourist thing. They're doing the same thing with the Laccadives. The Laccadives are literally going underwater as we speak, Lakshadweep. They've done away with so many kinds of environmental regulation. There's a lot of endless greenwashing talk that's intended for the COP meetings. But behind that, the sorts of things that are happening, Forests are being opened up to mining interests all across India. I mean, I think we're just, on the one hand, you have this catastrophe that's of climate change already unfolding. And on top of that, you have patterns of human intervention that are compounding the disaster. Like what's happened in Joshimath.
Yes, totally.
It's such a profound irony that in your fervor to create more, to send more pilgrims, you're actually destroying the pilgrimage. The whole point of going to the pilgrimages of Kedarnath and Badrinath is that it was meant to be hard.
Exactly.
I remember when I went in my childhood, you would see these elderly people just lying down and measuring their length. Then they would get up, walk to the, then lie down, and they took them years to reach Badrinath and Kedarnath, what is the point of a pilgrimage where, you're shot up in these buses? So, these interventions are actually compounding the disaster at a rate and a scale where it's impossible to be optimistic about what lies ahead.
Totally. And unfortunately, what is still celebrated are superpowers, right? Big civilizations. And in the Nutmeg's curse, it's mainly on the last 400 years with, Dutch colonialism and what they do in Indonesia. But I was wondering, and would you perhaps know more about big civilizations and how they have trampled over indigenous ways of thinking and indigenous ways of being? I had read somewhere that the Chinese exterminated, for example, its elephants and tiger populations 1,000 years ago already. So I was wondering, to what extent there has always been, on the one hand, indigenous populations who have lived very simply and in harmony with their environment, and on the other hand, people that have wanted to build empires.
That's an interesting question. On the question, I think you're referring to Mark Elvin's book on the...
Exactly, the Retreat of the Elephant.
The Retreat of the Elephant. I don't think it was an exterminationist policy as such. What happened is that, the population kept colonizing new parts of Yunnan and so on. And also, I think one has to remember with China that they have preserved sacred mountains, as entire ecosystems. Maybe without the charismatic species, but certainly, all the botanical stuff is still there in a way that really is becoming increasingly rare around the world. But it was really, in a way, this 17th century expansion of Europe that completely adopted these exterminationist ideas, wipe out the people, wipe out the landscape, and which they succeeded. So my book in The Nutmeg's Curse begins with the extermination of the Bandanese. The Banda Islands are a tiny archipelago in the far east of Indonesia. Their great blessing was that they had this tree, the nutmeg tree, which produces both nutmeg and mace, that is Javitri and Jaifal. But because they happened to possess this tree, the Dutch went and exterminated them and, literally killed them all off. There were just 15,000 of them, but there they were. And they replaced them with white planters and slaves, essentially. So, that was a blessing that became a curse. And now what we see around the world is really the same thing. That is, all the blessings of the earth are becoming curses. Whether it be fossil fuels or whatever it is. So the entire earth is now being subjected to the resource curse on a global scale.
Exactly. I found very interesting what Philippe Descola once said about the ways in which we interact with non-humans and our environment. And he said that, Western people sort of saw nature, as I was saying, as distinct and as inferior, and therefore something you could plunder, loot, and exterminate because humans were on top of everything. And that societies, he calls them animistic societies, which is like vitalism, I suppose, where you don't believe that you are not part of the environment, and therefore you don't feel that you need to protect tigers because you feel that tigers protect you as much as you do them. You're not condescendingly seeing them as, inferior. What he also says is that those who have a naturalistic way of understanding the environment have been colonizers. They have seen other humans as inferior, whereas those humans who have this animistic kind of feeling have always seen other humans as equals. And I find that very interesting, which is why I was asking you this question about the Chinese, and I was wondering to what extent perhaps it is a distinction between religions that are that preach hierarchy, and in the Analects, for example, Confucius is very clear that humans are on top. And there's this anecdote where the stables had burned down, and it said that the master comes and asks whether any human was killed, and the writer says he did not ask about the horses. And sort of that stayed with me because that is so different from how in India a lot of people interact and understand non-humans, right? You can be born as one. Gods can be avatars of, the boar can be an avatar of Lord Vishnu, etc. So I was wondering if it has something to do with also the kind of cultural and religious background that we may grow up with?
Unfortunately, I think now, wherever you look in the world, that sort of 17th century worldview and a sort of extractivist, colonialist economy has been adopted everywhere. So what we see is that in India, in Indonesia, the elites are auto-colonizing. They're sort of colonizing, they're adopting wholesale those extractivist methods. They're evicting indigenous peoples in the same way, accompanied by the same discourse.
Exactly.
Both these people are primitive, they're animist, and so on and so forth. You even see schools for the re-education of Adivasi children, on a model that's completely borrowed from Australia and Canada and so on. So, you see this again in Indonesia with Papua New Guinea, you see it in China with the Uyghur and so on. So, across the board, you see this thing. I would have liked to think, that at some point, some sort of culture kicks in, and that you draw some lines. But it's impossible to hold that view now. I mean, you look at the people who own these mining companies that are devastating the forests of Orissa and central India. These people are, most of them, vegetarians, some are even Jains. They wouldn't kill an insect if they could help it. However, they don't they don't have no qualms about destroying entire ecosystems. They don't mind at all. I mean, they'll just destroy a sacred forest, a sacred mountain, without a second thought. Even though everything in their culture and religion tells them that this is something completely wrong.
And through your 3 last books and the parables, you do 2 things that I feel are very, very important. You highlight the stories of indigenous people, and you make the non-human speak. And you start the Nutmeg curse by saying how it was 2 non-human entities, the internet and the coronavirus, both operating on a planetary scale, that had come together to create a ghostly portal that transported you back to the Banda Islands, right, to write about this. And in a way, you want to remind everyone, and I quote, of the invisible non-human presences that surround us, intervening in everyday life in ways that completely transform the meaning of ordinary events. So the spirit world, the non-human, has been a recurring theme in your books. It is there in the Calcutta Chromosome, in the Hungry Tide, in Gun Island. And I was wondering if that was a way for you to reclaim a very Bengali identity. Growing up, what I found unsettling was, on the one hand, my French parents telling me that ghosts did not exist, and on the other hand, the bhuter golpo I used to hear in the villages, which were really terrorizing. And, also all of the short stories by both Tagore and Satyajit Ray, who both of them, they rose against obscurantism, superstition, and everything, and yet they have amazing ghost stories. And so I was wondering if, you the very, very modern, rational Bengalis also talking about ghost stories. And so how do you reconcile these identities? And how does the ghostly world, how does the non-human animate you?
See, the thing is, as soon as you accept the existence of non-human spirits, say in animals, I mean, you have to accept that there are all kinds of other spirits as well.
Our ancestors.
Once you open that door, you can't close that door again, you know. I mean, then spirits sort of teem. The world becomes a teeming place of spirits. And, you know, say Ravi Thakur, Rabindranath Tagore, he writes in one of his, I forget where, but that in Jorashako, in their house, there was a tree which they all knew to be filled with spirits. So they lived with this. It was completely normal. You know, it's not something that you were scared of or that you were in terror of. It was just there, and the spirits were there. And you walked around it, or, you know, you knew at what time of the day the spirit was there. You knew what the spirit liked or didn't like.
What it looked like.
Yeah, and this is true across Asia. I think even more than India, you know, it's Indonesia that just teems with spirits, with the whole spirit world. So, I mean, Indonesia is the only country where you actually have a town named after a spirit, Pontianak, you know, which just is a vampire. It's a kind of vampire spirit.
Yes, yes.
And so, you know, you see this equally in Burma. They have their nuts, you know, again, which are everywhere. So, you know, for someone, I mean, I think of myself as a kind of, as an animist, you know, of some sort. And this world is just a living reality.
And this is what I really like. And I think that, you know, this is what, in a way, will allow us to be a lot more imaginative about our environment. You know, is to sort of build links, right, with spirits of trees, of animals, of ancestors. So there was that. There's that is very important. But I have been a little bit troubled in these last couple of years with how the left is seen to be allying very closely with a lot of conspiracy theorists. Many of them claim to be, you know, indigenous or nativist. Conspiracy is not just about the deep state, but also those that believe that, for example, the coronavirus could be cured by cow urine, or that cow dung can protect us from atomic radiation. So on the one hand, reclaiming parables and living along their injunctions, but on the other hand, you know, being wary, a little bit like Satyajit Ray, of beliefs that are unscientific, right? Because against COVID, vaccines will probably work better than coronil. So these new movements I see as having a very deeply problematic relationship with science. And these beliefs end up harming more the already marginalized and poor. So I was wondering, you know, how do you think through these things?
I think one has to approach everything with in the same skeptical spirit, you know, in the same critical spirit. Because look, it's not like science is always right. It's not like the experts are always right. I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were told that Sweden would suffer a COVID apocalypse because they took a completely different approach, you know, to the pandemic than other countries. But in fact, that hasn't materialized at all.
But they did have more deaths than Denmark and Norway.
Slightly more, but then it equalized. So I think, frankly, we don't know. We just don't know what happened. And we won't know exactly the outcomes of the COVID reality for, you know, for many years from now. But in any case, the idea that science gave us ways of dealing with pandemics is in itself extremely questionable, because, you know, basically the way we deal with epidemics goes back to the Venetian practices, you know, from the early modern era, from the 16th and 17th. I mean, the whole idea of quarantine comes from quarantina, you know,
the 40 days.
40 days. And these were invented not by doctors, they were invented by city fathers.
Ibn Battuta also talks about it, and so it was very important to quarantine. So everybody knew about this. But,
So I just don't think we know sufficiently. And just to resort to expert opinion, I think that's something we should be very skeptical of. Because in relation to climate change as well, the experts are constantly telling us now that they want to create, this world where you have these sorts of scientific inputs and, these sorts of technological fixes. But there's a very good anecdote in a book by Paul Kingsnorth, who's a British ecologist and so on. And he has a fish tank. And, he talks about how every day he has to study the chemical composition of the water, how much to put in, and all these things that he has to do to keep the fish tank working. Whereas, if you think of a river, the river delivers all these services for free.
Or the pond, the pukur.
Or a pond or anything. So, do we really want that kind of fish tank world, which the experts want to create? Now, I do think, there are certain things on which we must be skeptical. For example, cow urine or whatever. But again, we have to accept that we don't necessarily know. I mean, maybe there's
Baba Ramdev has made a lot of money.
Let him know. But for myself, I wouldn't do it. But am I going to say nobody should do it? I mean, not using their best judgment? So I think, let's face it, science has been as wrong as any other field of knowledge. So, for example, the best examples are, of course, with genetic engineering of various kinds, and going back to the 1880s, all kinds of eugenicist theories which remain popular to this day. So I think we have to approach those ideas with the same skepticism that we apply to other ideas.
Definitely, but smallpox was eradicated.
Yeah, but the smallpox vaccine goes back to indigenous practices in China, from the 8th or 9th millennium.
But you still had a lot of people dying of smallpox. You still had a lot of people. So this is why I sort of are, I share your openness to a lot of this, but I personally have been a little uneasy with this whole, there's the rise of mediums. I don't know if you've noticed all over Kolkata, there are Jyotishis of all kinds. And okay, if people want to believe it, fine, but it goes back to one group of people making money on the backs of others, And so,
see, with all these phenomena, the real problem is that it's very hard to separate the grain from the chaff. I mean, you are going to have thousands of, people, basically fraudsters of various kinds, just making money from this thing. But at the same time, there are uncanny and inexplicable ways of knowing that we don't know, that you can't explain scientifically, For example, the CIA had this very successful remote viewing program, It's been written about at great length, where a person would just sit in a room in California and they would give him the coordinates of a Soviet missile silo, and in the missile silo, and in their minds, they would see and give extensive descriptions of those silos. So, why should we be surprised that humans do have uncanny and inexplicable abilities? After all, chess masters have abilities that I don't have. Ramanujan, the mathematician, he saw numbers as his friends, which I don't see at all, in fact. So people do have these abilities. Why should we deny that? You and I, we've known Baules in the Sundarban who have these amazing relationships with animals. What are we going to say? That they're just lying to us? No, I don't think they were lying to us.
I agree with you. Yes. So reading your last 3 books, I also feel that you give us a lot of hope. There are rays of hope by bringing to life these alternative visions of human flourishing in consonance with what we, in relation to this vitalist worldview. And in a way, I feel, a little bit like a rishi, you offer these parables or simple spiritual stories. Stories that one might have heard preached from the pulpits or at pravachans, And in some sense, they are devoid of epistemic complexities, but they have a simple message, do good, do not kill, do not be greedy, and all of that. And I was wondering if this can work if we are not organized as a communitas. As the whole planet needs to start thinking of each other as one big system of brotherhood, because otherwise. And I think this is what you're doing through your books recently, especially Jungle Nama and The Living Mountain. It says it, you're trying to convert us into sort of feeling this kinship spirit, not just with the environment, but also with each other.
Look, it's hard enough to create feelings of brotherhood within, let's say, one community or even a city. I mean, if human beings were so inclined to good feelings, we wouldn't have had the caste system, we wouldn't have had slavery, we wouldn't have had, all these forms of domination. So let's, of course, we all hope that there'll be a miraculous conversion and everyone will become, will profess brotherly feelings. But in the meantime, I'm just a writer. All I can do is write my stories. And, I write the sorts of stories where, you see other kinds of relationships occurring really just within your pages.
But this is so I'm going to end with a few words here and then open it up to the public so that you can ask questions. So I'll just end with this quote from Ananya Kabir that says that the strongest thread running through your novels is that despite the vagaries and vicissitudes of empire, or even perhaps because of them, people find ways of connecting and of building new communities. And I feel that this is what you offer through these last 3 books. Thank you very much. And the floor is open to people who want to ask questions.
There's a question here.
I have a question for each one of you. Mr.
We can't hear you. Can you please speak up?
Okay. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. I have a question for each one of you. For Mr. Ghosh, the question is, I think everybody present here is part of the colonialist, upper class kind of background that you were speaking of. So we as individuals, what can we do to change, I mean, at least try to change things? We fly around, as you do, as I do. We use cars. So that's one question for you. And for Annu, who I know a little bit, we've had this altercation before during Corona.
Hi, Sujata-di.
Yes, hello. So we've had this altercation on Facebook. And I'm not getting into the Corona thing, but I would like to point out that science, modern science, is based on change. If you've read Stephen Jay Gould, who's a well-known anthropologist, in his book called The Mismeasure of Man, I think, he talks about how science is based on change, that nothing stays permanent. So how can you be so sure that science will give answers to Corona or anything like this? And so these are my 2 questions. Thank you.
Shall I answer the first question first? I think to ask what we can do individually is to ask the wrong question, because obviously we can't change these big systems ourselves. And in fact, it's now known that British Petroleum spent something like $100 billion creating this idea that it's your problem, it's your fault as an individual. Look, if the planes, if flights were rationed, you wouldn't be taking flights all the time. If there were better public infrastructure, you wouldn't be driving all the time. And that's what's happening, for example, in Amsterdam, in many other places. So We have to think about systemic change rather than individual behavioral changes. Not that the latter are unimportant, but the former are much more important.
You said whether time was change or science was change, I couldn't hear. See, for me, the thing is, I grew up in Shalkia, okay? Where I had people, I lost a friend to meningitis. My school Darwan's, the school Darwan was blind in one eye and totally pockmarked. And when I asked him as a 5-year-old how he was, blind in one eye and pockmarked, he said, "I'm lucky, the entire village died of smallpox," okay? We used to go to Bihar also a lot as a child, and for me, I have seen what lack of soap can do to families. Our neighbors in Shalkia had lost 2 daughters, and the stories, and as a child, these things mark you. The stories were that there were worms coming out of their ears and noses. And the 2 girls called Ganga and Jamuna had died of worms. So the thing is, I have a mother that is going to give us neem pata against worms, because we had those when we were small, and a father that quickly went to take us to doctors and got medicine so that, we can take those medicines. So I don't know, perhaps the neem pata would have worked completely. But, which is what I tell my parents now, just do everything. You want to do Ayurveda, but also take your vaccine, just whatever works, just try it out. The thing is, I don't think I can be complacent having grown up with that kind of background, and I swore to myself that never would I be in a place where, anybody close to me would die in these terrible conditions. And this is why the first thing I did was vaccine my kid against meningitis, and not everything, but some main things where you think, well, you can do that, today. But it doesn't mean that I also don't let him play barefoot in the Sundarban with the other kids and all of that to build his immunity. But I am wary of saying, no science. I don't think there are many cures against cancer that are not based on medical professionals in hospitals doing things for you. And I have a friend's mother who died because she refused to take everything. Within 6 months, she was dead. She would probably have also been dead if she had taken medicines. This was her choice. This is what she wanted. But the thing is that, between the two, I still prefer modern day, certain things around health and hygiene than what used to exist. So that's my position.
Sir, can you, the systemic changes that you spoke about just now, can you please elaborate on that?
Certainly. So, we have to create grids for alternative energy. We have to create systems of rationing for water. Water, most of all, fortunately, here in Bengal, not so much, because we have surplus water, but certainly in central India, in northern India, they're facing an enormous water crisis. Already in California, there are water rationing systems in place. I think we have to do what, let's say, Singapore and many other countries do, which is limit the number of cars that are available, impose very high costs on cars. So there are, create more bicycling lanes and so on. So there are so many systemic things that can be done.
This is so important. Thanks for saying that. I really think Kolkata should cut down. She said she would make it into London. London has congestion charge, which means that if you bring your car into London, you pay a lot of money. Here you give loans to people for them to buy cars, and the traffic jams increase.
They do that in England too.
Sorry?
They do that in England too.
I know.
So my question is to you. You have said in your book, probably the great derangement, that non-humans should not only be the stage to where the human history is played, but should be the protagonist of serious fiction. But then we have got The Living Mountain and the Jungle Nama, not completely in the genre of novel. So my question is, do you think that non-human protagonists in the genre of novel can be taken as serious literature without minimizing them just as, children's literature or mythology or something like that?
Well, it's a challenge because within the form of the modern novel, it's more and more. It's very human-centric. The modern literary or serious novel. But I was just reading on my Twitter feed some guy in America complaining that all the best-selling movies and books now are about superheroes or vampires or Frankenstein stuff or zombies or whatever. These are all non-humans. Actually, one of the weird things is that the more you try to suppress the non-human, the more it reasserts itself and it comes back in completely unexpected ways. So in popular culture is completely obsessed with the non-human, Similarly, even within the literary novel, I must say within these last few years, I've seen more and more of an engagement with the non-human in contemporary writing. But I would say, especially in Indian contemporary writing, Gitanjali Shree's book is full of, all kinds of elements of the non-human, of non-human agency of various kinds. I see this more and more, say, with Janice Parriott's new book. So it can be done, it is being done, and let's face it, to me, I think this is the most important development in contemporary writing.
The gentleman at the back there.
He's got the mic.
So my question is to you, sir. I wanted to know how it is possible for readers of literature to engage with the question of environmental crisis vis-a-vis reading, especially the genre of non-fiction, which even to this day is included in very sporadic amounts in the syllabi of, say, undergraduate or postgraduate students.
It's not a question I can really answer because I'm not a teacher as such, so I don't teach undergraduates, and I don't know how you would do that. But maybe Annu can answer this question.
Sorry, what was it
because
again?
She is a teacher.
I am, yes.
The question is how we can combat the question of understanding the environmental crisis vis-a-vis reading non-fiction, especially like non-academic non-fiction, not an essay or an anthology, barely included in the syllabi of undergraduate or postgraduate students, especially in Kolkata.
Oh, you know that I teach at Kriya University, and I have a course called Beasts, People, Wild Environments, where I have a lot of novels, I have poems, and I have films. So I cover different topics, but through these. So maybe it has to be started in Kolkata, but I can share the syllabus with you. And basically, yes, it's an entrance to this course through fiction and non-fiction also, but mainly through fiction and through films. And I think the students really love it. Yeah.
Lots of questions back there. Two more.
So my question is to you. So how much of a contention do you think we must make with the conventional scientific temperament in order to accommodate the existence and consequences of having non-humans in our history and our lives?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that very clearly. Could you repeat the last part?
So I said, how much of a contention do you think we must make with the conventional scientific temperament in order to, accommodate and acknowledge the existence of non-humans in our lives?
That's a good question. And it's a good question to be asking in Kolkata because this was the home and workplace of Jagadish Chandra Bose. And, he demonstrated long before anyone else, sentience, not just in plants, but even in metals. And strangely, his work has been completely disregarded now. I find it so amazing that they can write books about the inner lives of plants and so on.
And not cite him, yeah.
And not cite him or mention him. And of course, in his own lifetime, he was very highly regarded here, but his reputation was completely destroyed in the West by conventional science, as it were. And now we see that he was right.
Hello, sir. Hello, ma'am. Actually, I gathered up a lot of courage to ask you questions. Few years back, if anyone asked me about Amitav Ghosh, it was all about Trideep, Ila, and Grandmom. So now that we are in Calcutta and we are in Kolkata, in my university days, we studied the shadow lines. So before started reading Hungry Tide, I was stuck in the shadow lines. So the jump you made, actually a biocentric approach you took throughout your novels from the Hungry Tide till Jungle Nama. So I wanted to ask, how did you indulge yourself in environmental writing so much that, I understand you want us to be more conscious towards literature, towards environment through literature. So how did you, make that happen, or how did you indulge yourself to do that?
I really can't explain how it came about, but I have a lot of interests. I read very widely. I started reading mainly geology a lot, and I found geology absolutely fascinating. I find botany fascinating. I find the history of geology and botany fascinating. So all these interests sort of came together, And the great thing about fiction as a form is that fiction is very forgiving. It's very wide. You can do many different things in fiction, and so it went in that direction. His comment is that even my fiction seems like non-fiction, but there's a long tradition of that. I mean, if you read Moby Dick, everything he's saying about whales, he's saying, he says, what does he say? The whale is a fish. He is very insistent on that. So I think there's a long tradition of writers engaging with the world around them.
Just okay.
Last question. There's a question from the front row. Okay. Sure. Yes.
Good afternoon. My question is that to some degree it is in human nature to discard concepts that we don't understand, and that is universal, I think. So how would that relate to humans not accepting the cultural methods in forested areas, and the people there not accepting the modern sciences?
Good, huh?
Yes, go ahead. Annu is going to answer that one.
No, I think you put it very well, and I think we have to work on sharing our knowledge, right? And keeping in mind that the environment needs to stay alive. I think that as long as we do that, then there is some way forward. We need to incorporate a lot more these indigenous stories into our lives. And I think indigenous people could do with some of the knowledge we have also. But yeah, keeping in mind that we are a whole, and that the most important is to keep our environment, our planet alive, right?
That's a much better answer than I could have given you. So, Annu, they're saying it's over.
I think it's over. Just the last one. Will you be writing the first part of the Bone Baby story?
No, I won't, because it's very dull, actually.
Okay. Thank you. It was such an honor and a, great, great, great privilege to be in conversation with you. Thank you so
much. It was
much.
a pleasure.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anu, and thank you, Mr. Ghosh. His books are